In this tutorial, we're going to take a look at how to simulate dynamics when using velocity switching sounds which don't offer control of dynamics after the notes are played. And the way to do this is so simple that many people just overlook it. In velocity-oriented instruments, we can simulate dynamics by riding the volume up and down. For example, here's a passage using a velocity switching string sound just as I played it in. But that's not how I imagined it sounding, and that's not how I need it to sound. What I need is this. And I need that so it fits in with this. And I was able to achieve that by simply riding the volume up and down. And I'll explain the various methods for doing that in just a minute. But first, I want to talk about the sound of the dynamic changes. Are they 100% realistic sounding? No. And that's because we're only hearing a change in volume without an associated change in timbre. And there are some little problems with the string sound itself, but overall, it's really not that bad. And most importantly, it conveys a sense of emotion which just wasn't there in the original. In fact, one of the most popular libraries out there, which gets tons of use in TV and film music, only provides velocity switching versions of many of their most widely used sounds. And the way composers impart dynamics to them is to ride the volume. It's done all the time. And here's how you do it. Adjusting the volume is done with CC7, MIDI volume. And on my setup, I've got a slider and a knob which outputs CC7, and the reason I have two controls doing the same thing is because sometimes I like the action of the slider, and sometimes the knob is more convenient because it's right there below the keyboard. But that aside, if your setup doesn't have a slider or a knob to generate CC7 messages, I would highly recommend getting something like a nano control so that you can quite literally perform the CC7 volume rides to simulate dynamics. Now maybe you're thinking, well, why are you spending my money for me? I can always draw in these curves on the screen, and that's entirely true, but there is something to be said about actually performing the volume rides on a slider or knob that tends to lead to a more natural sounding result. Now I typically play in a part with one hand and ride CC7 with the other, or for two-handed parts like the one I played earlier, I'll play in the notes first and overdub CC7 messages in a separate pass. And if I was any good at working a volume pedal, I wouldn't have to resort to doing it in two steps. I could do both at the same time. And I know some composers who do that with the pedal, but I just don't have that kind of talent in my left foot. Anyway, depending on which DAW you're running, CC7 messages can control the volume in one of two ways. With the first method, the messages are fed directly into the plugin, which changes its volume internally, and that leaves the fader on the instrument channel free to let you adjust the overall level of the part. Or the other way is where CC7 messages never get to the plugin, but instead they remotely control the fader of the instrument channel itself. Now, that's the method that I prefer to work in, and my CC7 messages end up as track automation, which is what all the squiggly yellow lines are all about. But you can use whichever method you prefer. There's no difference because a change in volume is a change in volume. Now, having said all that, I have the feeling that maybe some of you are wondering why it is I've been saying all along that with velocity-controlled instruments, we don't have the ability to change the dynamics after a note is played. Yet here I am creating dynamic changes in velocity-sensitive sounds. So, what's up with that?